So this year's conference is going to be a little different for me. I'm most comfortable taking a passage of Scripture and doing a study on it. And I'll break it down verse by verse, and we'll examine things like context and audience and historical relevance. And often I'll do a word study on particular texts. Theological scholars give this kind of study a term, and they call it exegesis. And exegesis is a Greek word, and it has the prefix ex, which means out of, and the word heget, I'm going to say this wrong, hegeistai, which means to lead or to guide. So when we put the two together, we get this idea of to lead or to guide out of something. To lead out or to guide out. With regard to Bible study, when we are reading the text, when we're doing exegesis, we are reading the text with the intention of trying to get something out of it, specifically the proper interpretation. There's a lot happening in the world in general these days, and in the United States in particular. A lot is boiling to a head, and with so much happening so fast, right before our very eyes, Paul had a goal in mind for this year's conference to be a little different from what we usually talk about. Now, in past 10 conferences, we've always had a focus, and this year's focus is going to be on this idea of Americanism. Now that makes things a little difficult for me because America isn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible. Americanism, per se, isn't mentioned in the Bible. So my assignment for this year was supposed to be this tag team effort between Paul and myself on this subject of America and religion. And I struggled with this at first. I was a little, when he first mentioned this, I was a little bit anxious about it because, as I already mentioned, I'm usually used to doing a Bible study. This is something that was going to be a little bit more, I felt it would be a little bit more research oriented, and it's not really my cup of tea. But I felt like I was put in this position where I knew I was going to have to take a topic and then build a theological argument around it. And the danger here in doing that is that now I find myself drifting down this slippery slope of eisegesis. Now in the case of exegesis, where we are trying to get things out of the text, eisegesis starts with an idea and then reads it back into the text. Most of what passages for exegetical study from the pulpit of most churches these days is actually eisegesis, even though they make a pretext of it being exegesis. This is the foundation of Calvinism, by the way. Calvinism is nothing more than Augustinian doctrine and Platonian metaphysics dressed up in Bible verses. I don't want to do that here. So I happened upon something recently that I think will make a good foundation, or let's say a jumping off point for my sessions this year. And like I already said, this is going to be a little different from my usual fare, in that I will be addressing a topic with less Bible study thrown in. My discussions won't be on doctrine, but I intend to draw comparisons between what we see happening in the secular realm of America today and parallel events that took place in Bible times, as well as within the walls of the institutional church today. I used to be an avid listener of talk radio. It was sometime around 1994, I would say, when I started listening to Rush Limbaugh, and we're all familiar, everybody knows who Rush Limbaugh is. I think I probably would have been around 23 at the time. And then just after the events that occurred on 9/11, I began listening to Glenn Beck. And from time to time, I would catch like Sean Hannity or Mark Levin whenever they happened to be on the radio. Like say if I was in the car somewhere and I had the radio on and I was just going somewhere, I would catch bits and pieces of their shows here and there. I own my own small business, and so I would always have the radio on at work, listening to the radio while I worked. And I'd have it tuned into the local talk radio station there. And of course, Glenn Beck would be on in the morning, and then Rush Limbaugh would come in at noon. And it was refreshing to hear somebody else repeat the same things that I knew I believed in. And it was nice to have your own ideologies validated. And it was also when I kept up to speed on current events. I didn't really listen to, I didn't watch television broadcast news. The radio station that I listened to was considered a conservative radio station. And so in that respect, whatever they would give their news reports at the top and the bottom of each hour, you usually didn't get the liberal spin on things that you would get. So not only listening to these talk radio hosts, but also catching the news every hour, I was always usually pretty up to speed on what was happening with regard to current events. But for probably the past 2 years or more, I've stopped listening to both Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh. And there are many reasons for this. And one reason is that I have become more confident in what I believe and how to defend those ideas. And I have Tank Ministries to thank for a lot of that, most of that. I understand my assumptions and conclusions on a more fundamental level. So I can articulate my thoughts without having to rely on what someone else may have taught me. I used to appreciate Glenn Beck's comedic style of broadcasting, but in recent years, he has become more doom and gloom. In his monologues, they have this tone of hopelessness, and he offers no solutions. It's just plain depressing to listen to him anymore. Rush Limbaugh is a great communicator, but his analysis focuses on symptoms, and he's not able to make the philosophical connections between assumptions and conclusions. He either doesn't understand that progression of thought, or if he does, perhaps he thinks that kind of discussion is too esoteric for his audience. Paul mentioned in his previous session about his take on the Pilgrims.
Did you get a text?
You mentioned, that's okay. You mentioned Rush's take on the Pilgrims and how you disagree with it, and you can't understand why he would take that particular position on them that he does. And I think it's just a matter of, like I already said, him not really understanding the philosophical progression of thought. That is a very high intellectual, most people don't think on that level. Okay, and so he's trying to reach an audience, and many people are just going to zone out if he starts talking in those types of, in that type of language. But I have to say that the major reason I have turned them off is because of the polarizing nature of their on-air personalities. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but nowadays, if you're found out to be a conservative, you are immediately stereotyped by the opposite side. This is especially detrimental for me as a business owner, because once people learn your political views, you immediately lose half your customers. And anyone who is in business for themselves will understand that. Furthermore, the workplace is not the place to use as a platform to promote your political ideologies. And we have all seen the backlash that has occurred with professional sports, right? I just saw a report today, the NBA playoffs first round of playoffs, their viewership is down. Their ratings are down 40% from last year. 40%. That's huge. That's huge. The NFL at its worst, when they were going through this whole Colin Kaepernick thing, their ratings were down 16% as a result of that. The NBA is down 40%. That's huge. That's almost half of your viewership. That's huge. So at any rate, I happened to come across a story the other day about an anonymous teacher from Los Angeles, from a Los Angeles school district, who called into the Glenn Beck program. And the only reason I knew about this is not because I listened to Glenn, but I happened to catch the story just scrolling through it was either my news feed or it popped up in as a recommended video in YouTube. I don't remember which, but this teacher had a faculty meeting recently regarding the coming school year. So I was able to find a clip of that show segment on YouTube. And I listened to the whole interview. It was about 10 minutes. And what I heard astounded me and angered me to my core. We've got birds and bells and jackhammers going on.
I finally turned mine all the way down.
Okay. What I'm about to tell you should astound you and anger you as well. How many of you, either by raising your hand or nodding your head in some way, and yes, if you're watching this on video, raise your hand or nod your head because I can see you. How many of you have ever heard the term critical theory? Paul, have you heard the term critical theory?
I have.
You have heard the term critical theory. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody know what it is?
Okay.
Critical theory is a social philosophy pertaining to the reflective assessment and critique of society and cultural. Hang on, excuse me, let me back up here and read this. Sorry. Critical theory is a social philosophy pertaining to the reflective assessment and critiquing of society and culture in order to reveal and challenge power structures. Let me read that one more time, okay? Listen carefully. A philosophy pertaining to the reflective assessment, remember, reflective, thinking back on, okay? Assessing and critiquing society and culture in order to reveal and to challenge power structures. Give you a minute to digest that. Okay? We're talking about revealing and challenging power structures. Okay? It has origins in sociology as well as in literary criticism. However, it argues that social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than by individual and psychological factors. In sociology and political philosophy, the term critical theory, listen to this, describes the Western Marxist philosophy of the Frankfurt School, which was developed in Germany in the 1930s, and it draws on the ideas of Karl Marx. Critical theory was first defined by Max Horkheimer of the Frankfurt School of Sociology in his 1937 essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, in which it describes a social theory oriented towards critiquing and changing society as a whole.
Changing society as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so critical theory then is in contrast to traditional theory. Okay, so whereas critical theory focuses on changing society, traditional theory was oriented only to understanding or explaining it. Got that? Okay. All right. In distinguishing critical theory from traditional theory, Horkheimer described it as a radical, emancipatory form of Marxist philosophy.
Wow.
Notice the use of the word emancipatory. What do you suppose is meant by that? if I use the word emancipatory, what connotation does that have?
Signifying freeing?
Freeing, exactly. So freeing in some sense. Okay? Freeing from what? Okay? That's what are we trying to free ourselves from or free society from? Okay? That's a rhetorical question. I don't really expect an answer from that right now. Okay? But this is, okay, keep this in your brain. Because you're going to see how this all connects. Okay. This version of critical theory derives from the use of the term critique by our good friend Immanuel Kant. In his work, Immanuel Kant wrote a work called Critique of Pure Reason. It also derives part of its philosophy from Karl Marx, as I already mentioned, through the concept that his work Das Kapital forms a critique of political economy. Okay, so we have two sides of the coin here. We have Kant's philosophy, which deals with more or less the religious and moral aspect of things, and Marx, which his philosophy was more of an economic critique, particularly on capitalism. Okay, so we've got two sides of the coin here being brought together in this critical theory. Okay, so you have two-pronged approach, one a critique of reason, which was Kant, and another a critique of economic factors, which is Marx. Okay. For Kant's transcendental idealism, critical theory means examining and establishing the limits of the validity of a faculty. Okay, I'm reading this here, so listen carefully. Okay. Critical theory means examining and establishing the limits of the validity of a faculty, type, or body of knowledge, especially through accounting for the limitations imposed by the fundamental irreducible concepts in use in that knowledge system. Okay, so we're talking about knowledge systems and the limitations those knowledge systems impose on society. You following me so far? Okay, take note of that because this is going to come to play here in just a minute. So understand that one element of critical theory deals with identifying the limitations of a knowledge system. Okay, so think now on an epistemological level, how we know what we know. What are the limitations of a certain knowledge system? Where does that knowledge come from? Kant's notion of critical theory has been associated with the overturning of false, unprovable, or dogmatic philosophical, social, and political beliefs. Karl Marx explicitly developed the notion of critical theory into the critique of ideology, linking it with the practice of social revolution. Critical theory has been applied within the social sciences as a critique of social construction in postmodern society. So what is critical theory? Again, its foundational ideologies are rooted in Marxism, which is to say communism, which is to say collectivism. Its goal is to either disprove or at the very least undermine reason and all forms of rational argument. Reason and all forms of rational argument. Remember, it says knowledge systems. Okay, this is epistemology. Any form of rational argument that we would use to support any argument in the pursuit of truth. Okay, the goal is to undermine those. Now, how does this play out? Well, that brings us back to the Glenn Beck interview that I mentioned. Now, let's take critical theory and add a current little twist to it. Because critical theory, remember, it's been around since 1937. But now we add a little twist to it, and we call it critical race theory. Okay? You take the basic premise behind critical theory and all that it's designed to do, but now let's add race into the equation. So according to this teacher now that from Los Angeles that called in, critical race theory is going to be a major principle upon which the California school systems will operate this year. And there are 5 major points to it. And these are the points that she mentioned. This was in this orientation
Okay.
that she was talking about. Point number 1, facts, data, and the scientific method are white concepts that are used in the suppression of blacks and other oppressed white people, or excuse me, and other oppressed people. Number 2, owning property is whiteness and must be abolished. Number 3, white people will only help a black person if it is in their own self-interest. Number 4, racism is inherent with all white people from birth. They can't help it and they are unaware of it. Number 5, racism is permanent. Now, there are so many logical fallacies in each of these statements that are too numerous to mention here. We could do a whole conference just addressing the logical fallacies in this alone. But we can certainly talk about the most obvious ones. Consider that first point, okay? Consider the very first point here, that facts, data, and scientific method are white concepts. Now here's where this is truly evil, okay? If facts, data, and scientific method are white concepts, if we use facts, data, and scientific method in support of an argument, we would call that reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
Please notice how this very first point is an assault on reason itself. But if you want to see just how evil this kind of thinking is, just how utterly insidious this type of thinking is, consider this. About 2 or 3 months ago, we had the media present us with these images of a white cop kneeling on the neck of a black suspect. And following the death of George Floyd, what was the narrative they kept hammering us with? Systematic
Right.
racism.
Systemic. Right.
Systemic racism.
Right.
Systemic racism is the reality they're trying to sell us. Okay, now I can present to you all kinds of facts and figures to prove to you that this notion of systemic racism is false. I can talk to you about the number of black on black crimes. I can show you statistics that show that that there have been more white people, innocent white people killed at the hands of police, than there have been black people. We can talk about the percentages of black crimes as a percent of that population. I can cite to you all these facts, data, and statistics, and reason in support of my argument. But according to critical theory, if I use this kind of analysis in an attempt to reason with you, what does that prove?
You're racist.
I've just proved I'm a racist.
By virtue of the fact of using reason.
Yep.
Right.
My reason suppresses black people, and that makes me a racist. So you're screwed either way. Anyone can make any appeal to racism, and the moment you object, the moment you try to prove your case otherwise, in their minds, you have just confirmed the very thing they accuse you of. This is evil. Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of other time here talking about the rest of these points. Owning property is whiteness and must be abolished. Well, owning property is the most fundamental.
It's the American dream.
It's the most fundamental part, not just the American dream, it's fundamental to our individuality.
Right.
Our property represents us. When you own property, it doesn't matter whether it's land, car, a business, whatever it is you own, it is a product of yourself. Okay, it has nothing to do with being white. Okay, there are many, you know, so, in other words, if you were to use this type of logic, all right, there's no reason for, even for a black person. A black person should have no desire or ambition to seek to own property, to own property, because doing that would be following a white concept that is oppressing him.
Yeah, Uncle Tom.
Right. Okay. So, abolition of ambition. One of the 5 pillars of tyranny that John Immel has talked to us about. Okay. White people will only help a black person if it is in their own self-interest. Well, let's flip that around. If I were to say a black person will only help a white person if it's in his own self-interest, what's the first thing they'd call me?
Selfish.
Well, they'd say, that's racist.
Right.
Yeah.
That's racist. So what do you call, what's the psychological term? Is it projection or
What? Projection.
projection? Isn't that when you
You're projecting your own sin on other people.
yes.
Really what you want to do is condemn them, but the only catalog you have is what you know about yourself.
Right. Racism is inherent with all white people from birth. They can't help it and they're unaware of it. 4 and 5 here kind of go together. Well, that's just blatant determinism.
Total depravity.
Yeah. Well, yes, but yeah.
That's the religious
but determinism.
version. Yeah.
Racism is permanent. It's determinism.
Right.
And of course, if that's true, then why are we even talking about it?
Right.
What's the point of even talking about it if they can't? If these statements here are true, what's the point of even talking about it?
Perpetual repentance in order to be controlled by someone else who wants to control you.
Yeah.
But you know what? We can take this to a more evil conclusion, which is not too far-fetched.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we know that the abortion movement targets black communities and black children, black babies. If you think about this, if racism is permanent in all white people, who's to say government can't pass a law to say we have to have a final solution for racism? And that could include killing all white babies in the womb, because we've got to stop racism because it's a permanent thing.
Yeah.
It's not too far-fetched.
Well, it's all. You bring that up. A lot of these are the same arguments that Hitler used against the Jews.
Right,
Right.
right.
You said final solution. Well, that's what Hitler called the final solution.
Yeah, annihilation.
Yeah.
And then you can add to that, if you're a black person that believes in reason, you aren't really black.
Mm-hmm.
You're not the essence of. Oops. One moment,
Wrong
please.
button. That's okay.
I think that.
You got to be smarter than the camera.
No, you just gotta. Okay, you're good.
All right. All right. So let's go back to this first point here, because I'm going to camp on this for the rest of this discussion. This kind of thinking, this goes beyond just race and politics. This kind of thinking is pervasive in the church among professing Christians. And if you don't believe me, consider this. we have a post from a Facebook friend of mine. Now, when all of this systemic racism nonsense started breaking out in response to the whole George Floyd incident, you had these people coming out of the woodwork accusing whites of this or that. And we've heard it all before. We've had things like this notion of white guilt, white privilege. But after this whole George Floyd thing, this was all taken to a whole new level. You had demands for white people going out and actually apologizing for being white. Apologizing for their white privilege. It wasn't enough just to recognize it. You had to apologize for it. It went so far, and you could still look up videos on YouTube and find this. You had black activists going out with a video camera, walking up to white people, just random white people on the street, and demanding that they apologize for their whiteness. Demanding that they apologize for oppressing them. Total strangers. They would say, "Get down on your knees and apologize." And these people would do it.
Yeah.
I'm standing here watching this, I'm incredulous. These people are doing it. There's videos of, you have masses of people at these rallies. All this masses of white people standing in front, and a black activist on a bullhorn on a platform somewhere, making all these people get down on their knees, and they put up their hands and they're repeating after what the person is telling them to say. Repeat these words, whatever it is. I don't even know what they were saying. I can't remember what they were saying now. But being programmed and conditioned to repeat exactly what they were being told to say. And they were doing it as if somehow that made them good. Somehow they felt like they were being moral in some way for doing this. It was frightening to see the extent to which people would buy into this narrative, that they were convinced that they needed to apologize for being white. It was sickening. And it wasn't just in the secular arena you saw this happening. I started to see these sort of things happening, this sort of narrative being promoted by people on my friend list on Facebook who bought into this garbage. Church people.
Right.
They would post this kind of stuff on
Right.
Facebook. Okay? She posts this list of books here. Look what she says. You may have seen this image. You may have seen this image of anti-racism books. I created a Goodreads list to make it easier to find them. I'm unable to find who created the original image. I hope this helps. But look at some of these titles. Minor Feelings, America's Original Sin, The New Jim Crow. I can't read this one because it's fuzzy. Good Talk, Blind Spot, White Fragility, I'm Still Here, Colors of Law, The Color of Law, Stamped from the Beginning. I don't even, but the deal is, look, you're supposed to read all these books
Right.
so that you can learn about how racist you are.
And
Because apparently I don't know what it's like to be a black person, and I might be doing things as a white person that I don't realize are racist. So I have to read these things to raise my awareness about
Right.
what I'm doing so that I can somehow not be a racist.
And the reason the church is susceptible to this, the reason that Christians are susceptible to this is, world philosophy is secular, bad.
Mm-hmm.
Christian and all biblical truth, all Christians are guided by diligently searching the scriptures daily and drawing all of our authority. Of course, we know that's a bunch of bull. The authority is what authorities say that the authority says. But this is why they're susceptible to this. And secondly, the very orthodoxy of the Protestant church itself rejects reason.
Mm-hmm.
Martin Luther said reason is a filthy whore who should have dung rubbed in her face, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there's your critical race theory
Mhm.
right there.
Yeah. It's the same old tired rhetoric. As long as you acknowledge a problem, that's a good thing. It doesn't matter if you fixed anything. Raising awareness about an issue, and that somehow simply by raising awareness we have done something good. But we haven't actually done anything. We've offered no solution to the problem. We haven't solved the problem. Well, first of all, you have to even acknowledge that the problem even exists. You have to accept the premise that there is a problem.
But something is accomplished. You've now realized how evil you are, and now are more humble and willing to let the experts rule your life.
And that's church orthodoxy.
Right. But it's the same thing.
Yeah.
In this case, own up to your racism and your whiteness. And if you're a black person who believes in a reason, you're the same.
Right.
Okay? And now that you realize this and own up to it, you're more humble and more willing to let the elitists run your life. And by the way, partake in the true religion of altruism. Or altruism, or however. Altruism. Okay? Yeah. So.
But see, this is where this all comes back to critical theory. Remember that its critical theory is all about critiquing knowledge systems and changing society. Okay? What the goal is trying to get you to accept a different reality. There's a reality that they want you to accept, and so you need to accept this notion of white guilt and white privilege. Well, in my mind, I reject that premise to begin with, right off the bat. Okay? But beyond that, simply acknowledging the problem doesn't fix anything. The only thing that it accomplishes is to make you a slave to the narrative, which is exactly what they want. Okay? And that's what Paul was saying. So, you have these church people who are buying into this narrative. I want to show you this interaction I had. I couldn't let this go. I started out with just a simple solution. Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. We know this verse. Okay? The second is like to it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law of the prophets. Owe no man anything, but to love one another, for he that loveth another has fulfilled the law. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So I posted these 3 references. I probably could have posted more, but I said, maybe if everyone just followed these instructions, that would pretty much put an end to racism. That seems like pretty simple to me and a lot less reading. Just, I don't know. Well, she says, Andy, if the world was not broken by sin, we would have a lot fewer problems. This is typical church response here.
Broken, yeah.
If the world was not broken by sin, we would have a lot fewer problems, but it is. Do you keep those commandments perfectly? I don't. Oh, and by the way, I have no way to understand what it is like to not be white, other than reading or listening to those who speak about it. And this is another premise that I reject. That because I don't have practical experience with something, that somehow disqualifies me from making a rational judgment about it, that disqualifies me from being able to draw a conclusion about something. That's, I reject that. And that's what I say here. So, do I need to understand what another person is going through to show them love? I don't think do unto others as you would have others do unto you is predicated by first understanding their predicament. And she says, not necessarily, but I can possibly increase my empathy towards someone whose predicament I don't understand. I said, so you can increase your empathy towards someone. So then you're not really doing it for them, are you? You're doing it for yourself? You're doing it so you feel better? So the purpose of understanding someone else is not to help them, but it's to make you better. Right? Recognizing another individual as a human being and therefore valuable is the epitome of empathy. You don't need a book to tell you that. That's common sense. It's self-evident and the basis of all our rights as individuals. It is the foundation of Jesus' statement, love your neighbor as yourself. What's so hard to understand about that? Just treat someone the way you want to be treated. Duh. Isn't that what we tell our kids? Why is this so easy to forget? I have no idea what it's like to not be white. She's accepting the premise that because you don't have practical experience, you're not qualified to make a rational conclusion about subject. Okay? And then, her friend goes on and tells her, one of her friends jumps into the fray here, and she writes this about, she writes this thing about the story about the husband, the wife who thought her husband was selfish because he gave her the heels of the bread. And she finally complained. He said that, well, I love the heels, and so I was trying to be loving to you. I love the heels, so I figured I'm giving you the best. I'm giving you the part I like, so I'm showing you love. So blah 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 blah. And so she goes on. And she said, I realize the parallels aren't perfect, of course. Okay, yeah. Well, somewhere in there she made this statement where she said, we actually don't automatically know how to love people. I said, really? Treating others the way you want to be treated seems pretty straightforward to me. That's love. Hello, people. And then I gave a little response to her wife's story. And I said, frankly, it could be argued that the wife in the story you shared was not showing love to her husband because she was condemning him by her own law standard and seeking to wield control over him. Love doesn't seek to control others, and condemnation is the opposite of love. And if I can even be more blunt, I am tired of being tacitly condemned by people suggesting lists of books where the premise is basically, I suck because I'm white. That's the narrative we get every day from the progressive media, and now we're getting it from fellow Christians too. I'm sick of that crap. Okay? I'm sick of being told I suck because I'm white. How does this critical theory work itself out in the present day institutional church? We have this idea that rejects the use of reason, right? Critical theory is all about critiquing knowledge systems, okay? And if you attempt to use reason, that just proves that you are indeed whatever they are accusing you of. Doesn't matter what they call you. It could be a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe, whatever. So tell me this. What happens in the church when you have an objection to something?
Well,
What happens?
you get called up on the carpet and often have to go through church discipline.
Anytime we run into a confrontation with a pastor or elder over anything, and it doesn't even have to be doctrine. 9 times out of 10, it's not about doctrine.
If it is, though, it's because knowledge puffs up.
Mm-hmm. But if it's doctrine or any matter of orthodoxy, or maybe you haven't been tithing, or maybe you're having marital problems and you're seeking counseling, And what's the pastor tell you? You need to do some deep repentance. Excuse me. It's not COVID, I promise. You need to do some deep repentance because you are the problem, and you say, hold on, wait a second, I don't think that's true. Anytime there is a disagreement, what are the accusations? If you object to being told you're the problem, what's the first thing they tell you? What's their immediate response?
You're rebellious.
What else?
That's all I got from being a Christian, was I have a rebellious spirit.
Yeah.
And I'm not submissive to
Yeah.
authority.
You're not submissive. You're unteachable.
Right?
Yeah.
You are arrogant.
You're puffy.
You're puffy. Why?
Knowledge
Why?
puffs
Yeah.
up. To
Okay.
the puffy I say, stop reading your Bibles. Remember that one?
Oh. I still have that. I still have that saved.
Yeah.
Because the person, listen, hear me. The person who is in authority over you is among the enlightened few. They are the ones who are ordained to bring truth to the masses because they are the only ones who can comprehend truth. So they can tell you anything they want. You have to accept it because they are the ones that have the truth. Black Lives Matter. They have the truth. If you reject what they tell you, you've just demonstrated your racism. The pastor or elder in your church, they have the truth. If you reject what they tell you, you have just demonstrated your rebelliousness. They have a term for this. Do you know what it's called?
Oh. Depravity.
Depravity. You see, it's all the same philosophy.
It is. It really is. So it
It's
shouldn't
all-
surprise us that churchians are falling for this lock, stock, and barrel.
Right.
It's the core, and it all flows out of the essence of sin, which is a desire to control, and you control through condemnation.
It's all the same metaphysics.
Right.
In both the secular and religious realms, the premise always begins with human depravity. Pick your favorite activist movement. We've been focusing on Black Lives Matter, but you've got the alphabet community, you've got the feminists, the transgenders, you can identify with whatever gender you want. And if you disagree with any of them, the problem is with you. And in fact, the very fact that you object and your use of using reason, facts, data, and science is oppressing them. And it just validates to them that you are exactly what they say you are and you're the problem. You have just demonstrated your human depravity. You have just demonstrated your fundamental flaw as a physical being. That is the metaphysical premise of collectivism. That man is somehow fundamentally flawed, and this makes him unable to know truth. And this applies everywhere. So this is nothing new. This may have its roots in critical theory, may have its roots in Marxism and Kantian philosophy, but it's really nothing more than good old-fashioned Platonism.
And we look at what's going on TV, and we're like, these are just a bunch of Fruit Loops, okay? These are just a bunch of mindless Fruit Loops living in their parents' basement.
And the ones, and keep in mind, the minions, the foot soldiers,
Yeah.
are.
Right.
There's people behind the scenes that are pushing their buttons who know how to push their buttons, and they're the ones that are pushing this.
Right, but it's driven by ideology.
Yeah.
They're not out of their minds. There is a method to the madness. There is a logic behind what appears to be mad, but it's not. It's not. What would I call it? Just. It's not merely chaos that's not driven by some kind of ideology. So what you're doing, you're hitting really on the ideology that's driving it.
Right. Right. And if you remember, and I'm going to touch on this in one of my next, in one of my upcoming sessions, but if we go back to, I think it was 2013. I wasn't here for that, but John Immel gave us that whole evolution of Western thought from, started with Thales back in 600 BC,
Right.
and then Heraclitus and so forth. I'm going to speak very briefly about those in one of these upcoming sessions. But the idea was chaos, that the world is chaos. Well, what is the source of the chaos? Well, the physical realm is chaos. That is just the nature of a physical realm, is chaos.
Right.
So if your assumption is chaos, you're going to end up with chaos, or your political force is going to be to use chaos to achieve your ends. Right? So, this is also the reason why so many Christians buy into this. This is what they have been conditioned to accept. They're ripe for this. Because they sit in the pew every Sunday, and they have it preached to them over and over and over again, how depraved, how worthless worms they are. So they're already set up for this.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. When you can sit in the pew and be told that you suck because you are a worthless person worthy of hell, it's very easy to accept the premise that you suck because you're white. It's as simple as that.
And the whole thing of being born that way, you're evil by virtue of the fact that you were born white, and it's totally out of your control.
Yep.
And you're racist whether you believe it or not. What part of that is not the doctrine of total depravity?
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And, I mean, I hate to say it, but I've been saying this for years. Okay?
The minute you object, and as John Immel says, take responsibility for the content of your own mind, the moment you do that, you say, hold on, that's not right, and here's why it's not right, and you make point A, point B, point C, and you put together this well-reasoned response to their assertions, doesn't matter. You have just shown them the very thing that you accused them of. And this is diabolically evil by design, and there's no way out of it. You're screwed. There's no convincing the detractors. This is why people reject facts. This is the very reason why your arguments go nowhere with people. You know, what's his name? Ben Shapiro. When he likes to say this all the time. Facts don't care about your feelings. You know, and that's true. But facts don't matter to people like that because the minute you use facts, you've just validated them. You've just validated their assessment of you. It's ego investment is part of it when it comes right down. But when it comes right down to it, people will reject your argument because to them your objection alone regardless of all its merits, is all the evidence they need to prove that they are right. So I think the next obvious question is, how do we combat this then? And I don't know that we can, really. I don't know that we can. I think we can start with our children, right? And equip them to be able to recognize this kind of thinking and teach them how to reject it. And for that very reason, that's why they're introducing critical theory in schools. The entire California school system is on board with this. Okay? Look at all the endorsements for critical race theory. California Department of Education, California School Board Association, Association of California School Administrators, Bay Area schools, that's San Francisco and Oakland, California Conservation Corps. Okay? The whole California school system is on board with this, and as we know, as California goes, so goes the rest of the nation. So be ready. It's coming soon to a neighborhood near you, right? Okay. We need to be aware of what is happening in our schools. And I think it's critical to get our children out of state-sponsored education. And I'm sorry, Susan, whatever your opinion is of public schools, I know you have a very high opinion of public schools, and I don't intend to minimize that in the least.
Actually, I don't have a opinion.
Well, from what you say, given your experience of teaching in the school system, and then what you came to discover once you moved over to the public school system, I can appreciate that, and I'm sure, I'm sure that's a very valid assessment.
But you have to remember, I've been teaching school for 47 years.
Mm-hmm.
Those positive public school experiences
Mm-hmm.
were 30 years ago.
Right,
Yeah.
that was the
Right.
point I was gonna make.
Right.
30
We're
years
talking
ago.
70s,
Right.
maybe latter 80s, 90s on, yeah, it all does go to hell in a handbasket.
Right.
And my part of education that I went into after that was with, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. I felt I had a chance to really teach when they were that little, because then politics wasn't important in the classroom. It was more getting these little ones on their developmental levels.
Mm-hmm.
And however, now that I'm not in preschool, the curriculum of preschool is following all of this right down of what we're supposed to teach, the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And it's seeping down into that
Mm-hmm.
curriculum there.
Right.
And, but would I teach in public school right now? If given,
Oh,
you
no,
know, I would not.
no, you can't.
I would not. I could not with a clear conscience. And I know
Okay.
Christians are needed in the public school system, whatever, but at the same token, there are good teachers in the
Oh,
public
yeah.
school, but their hands are constantly tied.
Absolutely.
I hear this complaint from my friends all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I wish they would just let me teach.
Yeah. Yes, there are and the numbers vastly outweigh, the numbers like that vastly outweigh the ones that buy into this system. And you call them we think of them as the silent majority. So yeah, and it's unfortunate, these people who just they love to teach, they love kids, they want to be a part of nurturing and instructing the next generation, and they're entirely devoted to it, and the things, and my heart breaks for people like that who don't really know what else to do, though, So, but I throw that caveat in there because I don't want to in any way minimize or discredit anything either one of you have said in the past regarding public schools, okay? Because I think your opinion, your experience there is valid, and it's worthwhile to mention.
Right.
Okay, be that as it may, we're still talking about a state-sponsored system with an agenda. Okay?
Right.
And this is why,
No doubt
especially
about that.
today, more than ever, it is vital, it is critical to get our children out of state-sponsored education. Because you are seeing this kind of thing happening at an accelerated pace. If there's going to be one positive thing that comes out of this whole pandemic farce, is that large number of parents now feel empowered, finally feel empowered to take responsibility for the education of their own children. You have stories about where there are so many parents in North Carolina were trying to register on the state's website with their intent to homeschool this year. They crashed the system.
Right.
The system couldn't handle the volume of people that wanted to homeschool their kids this year. And even if you don't feel that homeschooling is for you, you need to be aware of what your child is being taught. There was just a news story just this week. There's one particular county in Tennessee. The school district is okay. So if you're doing the online school with your kid, if your kid's doing online school this year, this one county is requiring parents to sign a release stating that they will not monitor their child's online activity.
Do what?
They don't want, when a kid is sitting there in
Right.
front of his computer with his teacher having school, the parent is not to be allowed to be there in the room monitoring the class. And they have to sign a release stating that they won't do that. And if they're caught violating it, then the kid gets booted out of online school. Now they claim it's a privacy matter because, the teacher is not just interacting with your student, but they're interacting with other students at the same time. So another student talking to the teacher could be overheard by that parent, and that's violation of privacy with other parents' kids. And
Nah, that's
I
pretty,
don't know.
That's pretty lame.
that's pretty weak. That's a pretty
Right.
weak excuse. But just the notion that you have to say that you're not going to monitor what your kid is being taught, that's a frightening proposition.
Right.
So you start with your own kids and instill in them the right principles and teach them how to think for themselves and develop critical thinking skills.
Well, it's a short step. Nazi Germany said, hello teenagers, hello children, you side with our ideology, and as the state, we will side with you against your parents. So the Nazis had these youth camps where, kids were allowed to do a lot of different stuff they weren't normally. I mean, the Nazis, fed into these young people's natural tendency to not want an authority hovering over them, to divide them from the oversight of their parents so that they could be wards of the state. And, we're a short step away from that through the public school systems at this point.
So start with your kids.
Yeah.
But beyond that, there are always going to be some people who will never budge. But most people never take time to evaluate where their values and
Right.
their ethics come from. So
Right.
you have to appeal to them on that level and help them to understand the assumptions behind those values. Not only those values, but also the conclusions to where those values always lead. If you think some way, if you believe something, and you believe it's good, understand that's going to take you somewhere. It will always take you to the same place. And by all means, keep preaching the truth, because sooner or later someone will listen. Sooner or later someone will listen. Sooner or later it will click. That's it.